In 1932, a family of 8 in rural Appalachia ate almost entirely from a quarter-acre of ground behind their house. Not as a hobby, not as a lifestyle choice, because the alternative was going hungry. That quarter-acre produced cornmeal, dried beans, cured pork fat, preserved tomatoes, root cellar vegetables, and medicinal herbs. Enough to carry a family through a winter when the nearest store was 12 miles away and there was no money to spend in it anyway. I've been studying how they did it for the past 3 years, tracking down diaries, extension records, oral histories, and the handful of people still alive who remember watching their grandparents work these systems. What I found was not a collection of tips. It was a complete, integrated approach to feeding people from a small piece of ground that is more relevant right now than anything sold in a garden center. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 7 core principles of the Depression-era quarter-acre system, not as history, as a working method you can apply to whatever ground you have this spring. And stay with me, because at the end, I'm going to share one specific technique I found in a 1934 county agricultural diary from Harlan County, Kentucky. A succession planting method that extended a family's fresh harvest from 3 months to nearly 9 months on the same ground. I've tested it for 2 seasons. It works exactly as described. Let's start with the principle that made everything else possible. Principle 1 is called the calorie-first layout, and it is the foundation decision. The single most important difference between how Depression-era families gardened and how most people garden today is what they planted first. They did not plant what tasted good. They planted what fed the most people for the longest time on the least ground. The calorie calculation was not academic. It was survival arithmetic. A family of 8 needs roughly 2,000 calories per person per day. That is 16,000 calories a day, 112,000 calories a week, across a growing season and a winter beyond it. Only 3 crops produce enough calories per square foot to meet that demand from a quarter acre: corn, dried beans, and winter squash. These are not coincidentally the 3 crops that Native American farming communities across the Northeast had been growing together for thousands of years. The system colonial settlers called the 3 Sisters. Depression-era Appalachian families did not know the agricultural science behind why these 3 crops worked together. They knew from their grandparents that they did. Here is the layout. On a quarter acre, approximately 10,890 square feet, Depression-era families allocated roughly 60% of their ground to these 3 crops. 6,500 square feet of calorie production. Everything else, the tomatoes, the greens, the herbs, the root vegetables, occupied the remaining 40%. That ratio is the first decision. What feeds you when nothing else is available goes in first and gets the most ground. Everything else fills the space around it. Here is what to do this spring. Before you plan a single bed, calculate your calorie anchor crop. For most families today, that is not corn. It is dried beans and winter squash, which require less processing, store easily, and produce reliable calorie density from a small footprint. Assign them the best ground first. Then plan everything else around them. What to avoid. Designing your garden around what you enjoy eating fresh in summer without accounting for what you will eat in February. A garden full of tomatoes and zucchini is a summer abundance and a winter gap. The Depression-era layout had no winter gaps. Families working this system in Appalachia during the 1930s fed 8 people from ground most modern gardeners would consider inadequate for 2. The calorie-first layout is why. Principle 2 is called vertical stacking, and this is where a quarter acre starts to behave like more ground than it is. Depression-era gardeners did not think in terms of square footage. They thought in terms of vertical layers. The same ground that grew dried corn also grew pole beans climbing the corn stalks, also grew squash shading the ground below. 3 crops, 1 footprint. This is not companion planting in the modern sense, a tomato next to a basil for pest reasons. This is deliberate vertical architecture that multiplies the productive output of every square foot by growing crops at different heights simultaneously. The specific layering logic. Tall crops that provide structure go in first: corn, sunflowers, Jerusalem artichokes. Mid-height crops that climb use that structure: pole beans, cucumbers, small-fruited squash. Ground-level crops that suppress weeds and retain moisture use the shade below: winter squash, sweet potatoes, nasturtiums. Each layer serves the others. The tall crop provides support. The climbing crop fixes nitrogen into the soil shared by all 3. The ground crop suppresses weeds that would otherwise compete with everything above it. Here is what to do. Identify one area of your garden, even 4 by 8 feet, and deliberately plant all 3 layers this season. Corn or sunflowers at the back for height and structure. Pole beans at the base of each stalk. A sprawling squash or sweet potato at the front. You are not growing 3 crops in that space. You are growing one integrated system that produces 3 harvests from a single footprint. What to avoid? Planting in rows. Row planting is designed for mechanical cultivation, tractors, and horse-drawn equipment. It wastes 40 to 60% of available growing space to foot traffic and equipment access. Depression-era hand gardeners never wasted ground on rows they didn't need. Now, before we go further, if this is already changing the way you see your garden space, share this video with someone who gardens. Not a group share. One specific person who you know is working harder than they need to for what they're getting. That's exactly who this is for. Principle 3 is called the root cellar calendar, and this is the planning system that turned summer abundance into winter survival. A Depression-era garden was not managed by the week. It was managed by a preservation calendar that worked backwards from winter. Every planting decision in March was made with a specific question: where will this food be in December? The calendar had 3 columns. Fresh use, crops eaten immediately from the garden during summer. Short storage, crops cured and held for 1 to 3 months in a cool, dry space. Long storage, crops dried, canned, or root cellared for 4 to 8 months. The ratio these families maintained was roughly 20% fresh use, 30% short storage, 50% long storage. Half of everything planted was intended to be eaten in winter, not summer. This ratio is why they could feed 8 people from a quarter acre. They were not feeding 8 people from the garden in any given week. They were feeding 8 people from 9 months of accumulated production, stored in 3 different forms. Here is what to do. For every crop you plan to grow this season, decide before you plant which column it belongs to. Tomatoes, fresh use and canned long storage. Onions, short storage, 3 months. Dried beans, long storage, indefinite. Winter squash, long storage, 4 to 6 months. Sweet potatoes, long storage, 6 to 8 months. If your current garden plan allocates more than 30% of its space to fresh use crops, salad greens, cucumbers, summer squash, fresh herbs, you are gardening for summer, not for the year. That was a luxury Depression-era families could not afford, and it is why most modern gardens produce abundance in July and emptiness in January. What to avoid? Canning everything. Canning is labor-intensive and equipment-dependent. Depression-era families canned tomatoes and fruit because those were the crops that required it. Everything else went into dry storage, cold storage, or fermentation, methods that require no equipment, no fuel, and no processing time beyond harvest. This is a good moment to subscribe if you haven't already. Every week I bring methods like this, tested, specific, and built from people who figured this out under real pressure. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Principle 4 is called Integrated Pest Management, and it looked nothing like what that phrase means today. Depression-era families did not have pesticides. They had observation, timing, and plant placement. The pest management system was not reactive. It was architectural, designed so that pest pressure never reached a level that required a response. The 3 tools they used were companion placement, sacrifice crops, and timing gaps. Companion placement meant that no single crop was ever grown in a monoculture block large enough to support a pest population. Beans and squash were interspersed with corn. Tomatoes were separated by blocks of basil and marigold. The pest that specialized in one crop could not build a population because its food source was never concentrated enough. Sacrifice crops meant that 1 or 2 plants of a pest-attractive variety were deliberately planted at the garden perimeter to draw insects away from the main crop. A border of blue Hubbard squash drew squash vine borers away from the butternut squash in the main beds. The border plants were expendable. The main crop was not. Timing gaps meant that successive plantings of the same crop were separated by 3 to 4 weeks, so that when a pest population peaked on one planting, the next planting was either too young or too mature to be vulnerable. The pest's life cycle was disrupted by the garden structure. Here is what to do. Pick the single pest that costs you the most every season. Last year for me, it was squash vine borers. Identify what it needs: a concentrated monoculture of its preferred host, a specific window of vulnerability, a predictable egg-laying location. Then, disrupt one of those 3 requirements. Not with a spray, with placement or timing. What to avoid? Treating pest management as an emergency response. By the time damage is visible, the population has been building for 2 to 3 weeks. The Depression-era approach prevented the population from building in the first place. That prevention happens at planting time, not at the first sign of damage. Principle 5 is called seed sovereignty, and this is the one that Depression-era families understood as a matter of survival, not philosophy. Every seed planted on a Depression-era quarter-acre was saved from the previous year's best plants. Not purchased, not ordered, saved. The seed supply was the most important asset on the property, more important than the tools, more important than the soil amendments, because without seed, there was nothing to plant and nothing to eat. The selection process was rigorous by necessity. From every crop, the seeds of the strongest, earliest, most disease-resistant, most productive plants were saved. The weakest plants were eaten first, so their genetics never reproduced. Over generations, this produced locally adapted varieties that were specifically calibrated to the soil, the climate, and the pest pressures of that exact location. That is what an heirloom variety is. Not an old seed. A seed that survived because someone selected it, saved it, and passed it on because it performed when it was needed most. Here is what to do this season. Choose 3 crops to save seed from, starting with beans, tomatoes, and squash, which are the easiest. Mark your best performing plant of each variety early in the season with a piece of colored twine. Do not harvest fruit from that plant for eating. Let it fully mature and dry on the vine. Save the seed. Store it in a paper envelope in a cool, dry place. What to avoid? Saving seed from hybrid varieties. Hybrid seeds do not reproduce true to type. The next generation will revert toward one of the parent varieties and produce unpredictably. Save only from open-pollinated or heirloom varieties. The seed packet will say which it is. A family that saved its own seed could not be forced off its land by a seed company's pricing or a supply chain's failure. That is why it mattered then. That is why it still matters. Principle 6 is called the fertility cycle, and it is how Depression-era families maintained productive soil for decades without buying a single amendment. The fertility system was a closed loop. Kitchen scraps fed the compost pile. The compost pile fed the garden. The garden fed the family. The family generated the kitchen scraps. Nothing left the system. But the specific management of that loop is what made it sustainable across generations, rather than depleting the soil within a decade. 3 practices maintained the cycle. First, crop rotation on a 3-year minimum. Nitrogen-demanding crops, corn, squash, tomatoes, followed nitrogen-fixing crops. Beans, clover, peas, followed root crops that broke pest and disease cycles. Carrots, beets, potatoes. The same ground never grew the same crop family in consecutive years. Second, every piece of plant material that left the garden was returned to it. Corn stalks were chopped and composted. Bean vines were turned under. Squash leaves were layered as mulch. Nothing that grew from the soil was removed from the property permanently. Third, animals were integrated where possible. A few chickens scratched through the spent beds in fall, eating pest larvae and depositing nitrogen. A single goat grazed the cover crop. The manure went directly back into the compost. The fertility cycle had no leaks. Here is what to do. Draw your current garden layout and trace where your fertility goes. If plant material leaves your property in yard waste bags, that is fertility you bought with seeds and water and labor and then discarded. Find one thing you currently discard, grass clippings, kitchen scraps, spent plants, and route it back into the garden this season. What to avoid? Breaking the cycle with synthetic inputs. A bag of synthetic fertilizer applied to a garden that is simultaneously sending its plant material to the curb is a subsidy program for a broken loop. Fix the loop. The bag becomes unnecessary. Principle 7 is called the succession harvest window, and this is what I found in the 1934 Harlan County Agricultural Diary, the technique I promised you at the beginning. The diary belonged to a county agricultural extension worker named Edna Blackwood. She had been documenting the gardening practices of families in Harlan County, Kentucky, during the worst years of the Depression. One entry from June of 1934 describes a system she called the rolling harvest, a planting schedule she had observed in the most productive family gardens in the county. Here is the system as she described it. Every 2 weeks from the last frost date through midsummer, a new planting of fast-maturing crops went into any space that had been vacated by a harvested or finished crop. Not new beds, the same ground, replanted immediately. The specific crops she documented in the rolling harvest sequence were radishes and spinach in early spring, harvested in 30 days, immediately followed by bush beans, harvested in 55 days, immediately followed by a fast-maturing lettuce or turnip greens, harvested in 40 days, immediately followed by a cold, hardy kale or mustard green that carried through the first frosts of fall. 1 bed, 4 sequential crops, a harvest window that ran from April through November, nearly 8 months of fresh production from a single piece of ground. The key to making this work is 2 things. First, you need to know the days to maturity number of every crop you plant. It is on the seed packet. And count forward from transplant or direct sow date to know exactly when that ground will be available for the next crop. Second, you need to have the next crop's seedlings started and ready to transplant the week the current crop is pulled. There is no gap. The day you pull the last radish, the bean seedling goes in. Here is what to do right now Today, in late March, start your first succession planting of spinach or radishes in any available bed. Mark your calendar 30 days forward. On that date, those greens come out and bush bean seedlings, which you will start indoors in 2 weeks, go directly into that same ground. From that point, you are always one crop behind the current one. Always have a seedling ready. Always have something coming out and something going in. What to avoid? Letting ground sit empty between crops. Every day a bed sits bare is a day of solar energy, rainfall, and biological activity that produced nothing. Edna Blackwood wrote in her 1934 diary that the best gardeners she observed treated bare ground the way a good farmer treated a field, as a temporary condition to be resolved as quickly as possible. Depression-era families working this system in Harlan County extended their fresh harvest window from roughly 90 days to nearly 270 on the same ground, without any additional inputs. Here are 3 things I see in modern gardens that quietly dismantle everything that made the Depression-era system work. The first is designing for appearance rather than production. Raised beds sold in catalogs, decorative borders, matching labels, color-coordinated plant arrangements. A garden designed to be photographed and a garden designed to feed people make very different decisions. Depression-era families did not have a gardening aesthetic. They had a feeding imperative. The layout decisions that follow from those 2 starting points are completely different. The second is treating each crop as an independent project, rather than part of a system. A tomato planted without thinking about what it is depleting from the soil, what it will leave behind when it's pulled, what will replace it in that ground, and where its seeds will come from next year, is a one-season transaction. Depression-era gardening was not a transaction. It was a running conversation with the same piece of ground across years and decades. The third is outsourcing the knowledge. Seeds purchased every spring from a catalog. Fertilizer purchased every spring from a store. Pest management purchased in a spray bottle. Each outsourced element is a dependency, a vulnerability that did not exist when the knowledge lived inside the gardener rather than inside a supply chain. Every skill you develop, every seed you save, every fertility cycle you close is a dependency you have eliminated. That was the point in 1932. It is still the point now. Here is what all of this comes down to. A quarter-acre is not a small amount of ground. It is enough ground to feed a family if the person working it understands what they are doing. The Depression-era families who figured this out did not have better soil, better tools, or better weather than you have right now. They had a complete system and a clear reason to make it work. What they built, the calorie-first layout, the vertical stacking, the root cellar calendar, the closed fertility cycle, the rolling harvest, was not a collection of clever tricks. It was a coherent philosophy about what a garden is for. A garden is not a hobby. It is not a wellness practice. It is not a weekend project. It is the piece of ground between your family and going without. That is what they knew in 1932. That is what is worth recovering now. If this reached something in you, share it. Not broadly. Think of one person in your life who is trying to become more self-sufficient, who is working hard in their garden and not getting what they're putting in. Send it directly to them. That is how this kind of knowledge has always traveled, person to person, because someone thought of someone specific. And if you want more of this, the methods, the history, the systems that actually work, subscribe. Every week there is something waiting. The comment I want from you this week is different from the usual. Tell me one thing your grandparents or great-grandparents grew that you have never tried to grow yourself. I read every one, and those answers are going to shape what I cover next. I'll see you in the next one.